Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be here with you at the Sydney Dialogue and to lead this discussion on AUKUS, technology and the role of intelligence. The announcement of AUKUS's path to a nuclear-powered submarine capability for Australia just last month, of course, triggered a debate, I think a necessary and entirely appropriate debate. So what I'm hoping is that in this panel we can contribute to that debate today and perhaps shed some new light on the strategic context in which the Australian, UK and US governments took the weighty decisions that they did. Here in our region, the Indo-Pacific, we're seeing the balance of power start to shift away from the United States and its allies, undermining deterrence and reassurance. At the global level, we're seeing the increasing use of military force to coerce and to invade other countries, highlighted, of course, most dramatically by Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine. And we're seeing our long-standing technological edge starting to erode. In some cases, that edge is totally gone. We're seeing a growing overlap between national security, economic security, and technology as these elements become increasingly intertwined. And we're seeing governments around the world grappling with policy responses to that situation and regulatory responses. So I'm hoping that our panel today can tease out the role of AUKUS in maintaining peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific in particular, to talk about how the acquisition of nuclear-powered submarines under Pillar 1 can contribute to deterrence, but also, and the Deputy Prime Minister alluded to this, how AUKUS can drive wider innovation in the Australian economy well beyond just defence. I'd also like us to try to unpack how Pillar 2, which is the advanced capabilities element of AUKUS, can contribute in areas like artificial intelligence, autonomy, and quantum applications. AUKUS, I think it's fair to say, is built on trust, and trust is fundamental to the strong intelligence relationships between the three countries represented in AUKUS. So I'd like us to dig in a little to that trust and the nature of those relationships and the role of intelligence today, whether it's providing warning or giving our governments actionable insights about, for example, emerging disruptive technologies. The role of intelligence in protecting the advanced technologies that we intend to develop under AUKUS, and in countering disinformation levelled against AUKUS. So we'll talk about how we can build on these existing partnerships, bringing in new partners, including Japan and India and South Korea and others. But also how we as intelligence agencies can partner more effectively with business. And today we've got an absolutely outstanding panel to address some of these challenges. I won't repeat the introductions, but Sue Gordon, Principal Deputy Director of National Intelligence, over 30 years experience in the US intelligence community, a great partner of Australia over many years, and we really appreciate that. So it's great to have you with us. Stephen Lovegrove, former UK National Security Advisor, also a Secretary of the UK Ministry of Defence and a distinguished career in banking before that, so brings a very rich and varied background to today's discussion. And Michelle Simmons, Australia's leading quantum scientist, a world-leading quantum scientist indeed, and the founder of the first Australian quantum computing company, a real leader in this field. So fantastic to have you all with us here today. I'm going to kick off, Stephen, with you. You were one of the architects of AUKUS, the linchpin of Britain's participation in the initiative. And I'd just like you to talk a little about the strategic rationale for AUKUS. You know, what's your vision for the role that AUKUS can play if it's successful, as we all hope it will be, and also just to address any of the aspects of the debate since the announcement in March, and in particular whether there are any areas where you think that debate may be off track. So over to you.
Well, thank you, Andrew, and it's a great pleasure to be here. Now, I'm going to address the question you ask at sort of kind of quite a high level of abstraction in the first place, I think, because very clearly when we set off on the AUKUS journey, the concern has been that the world is increasingly interconnected. The Indo-Pacific, the security of the Indo-Pacific region is paramount not only to those nations that are in it, but also critically important to everybody in Europe. And we had a very strong sense that safety and security of free and open societies is under pretty much unparalleled threat at the moment. Those with very long memories obviously will cast further back and maybe sort of kind of dispute that, but I don't think there's any disputing that it's under more threat now than it has been for the last 35 years. And responding to that threat really was what AUKUS was and is and will be about. And it arises, in my mind, from two sort of interlinked things. One is the return of traditional geopolitics, where we have sort of kind of great power competition, we have competition for resources, very broadly defined, by the way. Data, I think, falls into that category as much as anything else. And a sense of national self-identity politics, which is driving what in more benign times would have been looked upon as sort of kind of deeply irrational, unpragmatic national decisions. And obviously the most startling example of that is the invasion attempted invasion of Ukraine by Russia. The second one is the technological developments that we are seeing sort of kind of all around us at the moment, and the fact that they are, as you rightly point out, eroding the advantage that the liberal democracies of the world, by and large, have typically had. And those two things are sort of kind of reinforcing each other. So taking data, for instance, it seems pretty obvious that the Chinese authorities are being able to take advantage of the fact that they have a different approach to data and therefore developing sort of different types of capabilities which will advance what they look upon as their own national self-interest. And it's an attempt, really, AUKUS is an attempt to readdress that balance and re-establish an advantage for free and open societies, liberal democracies. It's meeting those challenges, and I think very crucially, it's about pooling resources. I mean, one of the things that has been very obvious in the way in which authoritarian regimes around the world have developed is that they are very happy to mobilize enormous state resources in a way that liberal democracies by and large don't, because they rely on the market more. And we need to be able to find mechanisms and vehicles to be able to pull together the types of advantages that we have sort of kind of individually in concert rather better. Now, I mean, there are obviously lots of advantages and objectives underneath AUKUS that are sort of kind of sub-objectives in a sense. I mean, say a couple of examples. Hypersonics, the UK is a little bit further behind. Where we would like to be counter-hypersonics, we're rather further ahead. And a combination of Australian and American hypersonic capabilities with our counter-hypersonic capabilities is obviously a good one. My own hope for the nuclear powered submarine fleet in due course is that it is of sufficient scale to mean that some of the disadvantages we have in terms of the market go away and they become cheaper and then become more interoperable and much more flexible. But those are sub-objectives. The big objective is to protect free and open societies from what, as I say, is sort of pretty much unparalleled threats. I mean, I've already talked too long, but just to pick up on your last point, the one narrative that I have problems with around AUKUS is the one around proliferation. The Pillar 1 in particular is not about proliferation. It is not about nuclear weapons. It is about a conventional platform which is nuclear powered. And we need to sort of kind of recognize that and understand that Australia being able to field that capability will contribute greatly to the security and stability of this part of the world. And I do, if that is the end, the security and stability of this part of the world, we cannot wish away the means of getting there. And submarines of that type are the strategic platform. It's important that Australia has the ability to field them.
Well put, thank you, Stephen. Michelle, you've been at the cutting edge of quantum computing globally and here in Australia, and I'm interested, I guess, in what you would like to see come out of AUKUS, and that could be the first pillar that Stephen was talking mostly about there, the nuclear-powered submarines and their effects, their wider effects on the sort of technology ecosystem in Australia, but also the advanced capability pillar, pillar 2, which of course includes quantum.
Sure. I mean, maybe I'll just give a bit of an insight to what I've seen from the academic and startup community, and that is looking globally over the period of COVID. We all started to realize that we had limited supply chains and access to those supply chains. So every country started to look at what they manufacture in-house and how they collaborate globally. And I think that really was a wake-up, obviously, to everyone about the limitations that different countries had. And one of the responses to that has been that, certainly in the quantum area, lots of, pretty much every country has a quantum strategy, and it's accelerating that strategy rapidly in each of those countries, with literally billions of dollars of investment across the different schemes. Australia luckily got into quantum computing, particularly right at the beginning, back in 2000, so it's had an incredibly strong cohort of people that it's trained. So more than 1,000 people have gone through our centre in the last 20 years, and 270 PhD students that have gone all over the world. And so we have a position of global leadership in the quantum area, and I think what we've recognised is that, in any kind of technological area where you're at the forefront, you go faster if you collaborate with the best in the world. And so having a situation where the Australian teams can collaborate with the US and the UK and accelerate the efforts that we have now by working together, I think is absolutely critical for us going forwards. And so that's definitely what we're hoping for in the quantum space. I think there are unique things that Australia brings in the way that it partners and the way that it collaborates, that it can help with those relationships as they form into the future. But that's a field that I know well, quantum computing, so I see huge potential advantage in that space. But I think there are other areas, and they're outside of, obviously, the submarines. Being connected with those two countries across the world is absolutely critical for the future of our defence and security. So I think it's a very important play, getting AUKUS working well.
Thank you, Michelle. So Sue, just talk a bit based on your 3+ decades in leading in different roles in the US community, and the role you see intelligence playing in AUKUS.
Well, thanks. And our partnership is one of the best parts of my 30-year career, so I'm delighted to be here. Let me just bounce up, as Stephen did, and talk about intelligence for a minute. So intelligence, as I see it, is to know the truth, And really that's to look at the world as it is, not as you prefer it to be. Not any absolute view of someone's small view, but just that you see it as it is. To see beyond the horizon. And that's to not just know of fixed capabilities, but also to put that capability in motion, to know how it will be used and how it evolves. And the last is to allow leaders to act before events dictate. Right? That notion of advantage is the whole point of intelligence. And I know three things to be true given that. Number one is there is nothing about intelligence that is passé. Those three things I said we need, AUKUS needs as much as anything else. Number two, I know that the strength of the West, I have always said, was the fact that we have friends. Free and open societies have friends, and we are able to bring that to bear in times of crisis and conflict to great global societal advantage. And I think that is fundamentally what we're talking about. And then the third thing is this is a disrupted world, and how we have done the things that we've done in the past that we've been so good at, we are not going to be able to do them in the same way. So same outcome, different modality. And I think that's because, as Stephen and Michelle have both said, the world is so different. It's a world of technological ubiquity. That's every technology is available to everyone, and it's about who can put it to use fast, not just about the possession. It's a world of digital connectedness, which means that borders are obliterated, knowledge spreads, information disorder is prevalent, and we, as free and open societies, really have to think about that digital connectivity, because if it is not a trusted connectedness, it is more problematic for us than it is for authoritarian communities. And then it's a world of data abundance. And you might think that that data abundance would lessen the need for the traditional intelligence. That is simply not true, but it certainly is additive. What has been so phenomenal over my career is that intelligence sharing has been a foundational stability and bedrock for actions we take. There will be differences in policy, there will be differences in implementation, but what we have always shared is a clear-eyed view and ability to communicate on that foundational level, and I think that is one of the things that's incredibly important. I think one of the things that has changed the most is this is a world where economic and security threats are intertwined. That changes the nature of partnership. That changes when we want to bring other people into the fold, how we talk to them. And it changed because this is a world where the threats are disproportionately to and through information. And so how we think about that and how we use it, how we protect it, how we assure it, the ethical boundaries are all important going forward. But what I do know is that this ability that we uniquely have to have that common foundation, to be able to see and know and allow, is really what I think we can recreate in this AUKUS environment. Thank you.
Thanks, Sue. So just, I'm going to put this question to the entire panel, but sort of building on that shared sort of foundational understanding of what's happening in our broader environment. You know, two challenges that we grapple with as a community every day are around scale and around speed, and dealing with adversaries who are capable of operating at scale and simultaneously at speed, and thinking about some of the supposed advantages of more authoritarian states, you know, tighter central control, etc., versus our more siloed and sometimes, dare one say it, slightly disorganised or even chaotic character. How does the panel think that AUKUS can help us and play to our strengths and counter our competitors?
I'll start and you all can fix it. You know, it's the first one who speaks that gets the easy gig. So that world I described is easier for people without an installed base, right? It is easy for a new entrant to come in and do things newly. It is also easier for entrants that don't have the same view of the rule of law, but that's a conversation for a different time. So new entrants have an advantage because they can put things into use faster. And organizations with installed base have ways of doing things, ways they believe in. And those two things are ones that we need to address. What I think AUKUS does is actually what, and I think, Stephen, you said that free and open societies need, we need a quest, right? Because we're still dragging the Cold War with us. We still worry about the war on terror, but if we don't set a new quest, our obligations against that past view of how we work will be impediments to new way of working, whether that is introducing new technologies and new companies, or just working newly from a regulatory standpoint to do things differently. And if you don't have a quest, something that you must do, you can be really bogged down. And so I think one of the most beneficial things we can do is to use AUKUS to say, well, okay, if that's what we've decided we're going to do, then let's start doing things to allow that rather than doing things within a framework of our past.
I totally agree. I get very excited when I hear Sue talk, because I think the great opportunity for AUKUS is that we can think outside the boundary of what we've done in the past. I think one of the things that I've seen is that when we talk about collaboration with different nations, particularly at the moment, we immediately start to put up, boundaries with visas and regulations and FERB regulations so that you can't share technologies. And that's exactly the opposite way, I think, than we need to go at the moment. So we've got 3 countries that are aligned in our political thinking. And so now's the chance for us to increase the speed of our collaboration and set bold, ambitious goals that we can reach together. And so I've got ideas of how to do that in my field, which I'll share if people want me to share. But I think now's the time to really go for it. It's an opportunity to strip away those things that have prevented the collaboration in the past and accelerate the collaboration.
Why don't you expand on them, Michelle?
Yeah, so for example, in the quantum computing sphere, it's a global race to try and build the hardware and to prove its economic value. And I think it's a transformational technology that all our countries believe is just going to happen. It's a function of time. And so given that we all think it's inevitable, we should really be trying to accelerate how do we get there first, or how do we get there together first. And so a quest would be to get the 3 nations to work on like a 3-nation mission to build a quantum computer by taking the best of each country, both in the commercial and academic space, and accelerating that. And so a mission would be, I would say, every country puts forward its 2 or 3 platforms where it's leading. We create a consortium together, and we basically say each country helps the other to get there first on multiple platforms. So fast fail. So it's a bold thing to do, but it would force that collaboration. It would get rid of the boundaries. It would solve a lot of the collaboration issues, and it gives us a mission.
And the thing I'd add to that, and I love that, I think there will be detractors who, when we say things like do things new or do things faster or break down some barriers, they think that we're suggesting that you just do it willy-nilly without a consideration for security or fairness or ethic. That's not the case. But how we prosecute those things, and in intelligence security is a great example, changes over time. And so you can come up with new ideas on how you protect information and still allow yourself to move. So when you hear new, don't think a repudiation of the things that have made us so successful as a collective in protection, but just saying that protection cannot be the whole goal, because this is not a world where we can hold with what we have. We actually have to acquire more. So you have to develop new processes, not just new ideas.
Stephen.
It's a very complicated picture, and I think it's important to recognise that it's a very complicated picture. But I do think that the opportunities massively outweigh the difficulties, and what we need to do is to identify the opportunities and aggressively pursue them and minimize the disadvantages. So, I mean, the title of this session is Technology and the Role of Intelligence. And while AUKUS in the newspapers is typically accompanied by pictures of absolutely gigantic bits of ocean-going kit, in fact, a lot of it, I mean, really a lot of it is about technology and the role of intelligence. So clearly, nuclear submarines are an important, very important vehicle for collect. In some of the pillars, I mean, 5 pillars, I think I can remember from pillar, 5 technologies from pillar 2. Hypersonics, not particularly about intelligence, that obviously plays an important part, but electronic warfare, definitely, AI, definitely, cyber, definitely, quantum, definitely. They are about information and intelligence in very large part. And the point that Sue made earlier on is one of our huge opportunities, which is that it is inconceivable to me that, for instance, Russia and China are going to be prepared to share technologies and information in the way that our 3 nations are prepared to do so, and indeed other nations who may well want to come into some of these particular strands will be capable of doing so, and the Five Eyes is sort of kind of a great example historically of how that can happen. There's an enormous sort of benefit to us if we can manage to pool that those installed bases, as it were, of expertise, knowledge, experience, and skill, which are not going to be available to some of our strategic competitors. The difficulties are important, though. Michelle's sort of going to mention the problems that sometimes we have in getting the right visas, academic collaboration, and so on and so forth. That needs to be thought about really hard. And the other thing that really needs to be thought about, we're talking about information sharing here, and data sharing. This is the IP here, is the very stuff that the other guys want. And if we need to properly invest in making sure that what is inevitably going to be an increased threat surface as the sharing goes on, that threat surface is kept secure. Because otherwise, in the attempt to sort of kind of get ahead, we may sort of lose quite a lot of very important stuff. So it is complicated, but I'm certain the opportunities outweigh the difficulties. But difficulties there are.
You know, especially when you talk about the threat surface, the threat surface used to be governmentally controlled. Right. Now the threat surface extends to not only the private sector, but actually to the citizens. And then this is the bad news. National security decision makers are in those other 2 bins. Companies are national security decision makers. Citizens are security decision makers. And so thinking about if you were going to protect that threat surface that our adversaries and competitors are so willing to exploit, that is outside governmental control, and we know that protecting that is important to this success, I think that becomes a really interesting technological challenge in its own right.
So just going back to international partners for a moment, and you know, we talked about the role of trust. So that there are 2 imperatives. There's the one that you and Stephen have just talked about, which is protecting our technology, but there's also an imperative to broaden the, if you like, the coalition of countries that are trusted. How do you think about, you know, with all your experience, reaching out to new partners, whether it's Japan or India or South Korea, countries in Europe who are not in the Five Eyes, for example, and don't have that sort of 80-year accretion of trust and intelligence culture and experience working together? How do we do that and do it quickly?
So it's a challenge. I think you always have to bounce up to shared values. And I would be daunted by this moment, but we actually did it before. Yeah. On 9/11, we were awakened to what we had seen coming, but it came home in very physical form of a terrorist threat. And a terrorist threat was very different from the Cold War threats in terms of who held the information and more importantly, who was going to be threatened by this activity. And it felt like in almost a minute, yes, it was 20 years, but almost a minute, we figured out how to share information with people we had no idea how to trust because our lots were bound together. And if you look at those relationships formed with very unusual partners, far beyond the Japans and the Koreas and all the way down to the African partners that we just hadn't had anything. We learned how to do that, and we learned how to share information ahead of crisis because that's how you fended it off. So I think there are some models that we can use, but what it's going to require, I believe, and this is hard for us, is one, talk at the values level, and then two, recognize that there's kind of a rise of pesky sovereignty in a digitally, economically connected world where you can't just dictate how someone participates. You're saying, yes, we believe this, and then you allow implementation to go according to the partnership because you believe that. It's a hard, as to choose Stephen's world, it's easy to say, so hard to do.
Yeah, there's an assumption built into that we will accept more risk as well, it seems to me. And then it's our job to manage that.
I think the cultural change we have to make as a collective, as an AUKUS, is we are not so secure in our superiority that we can hold, right? That we can hold on to what we have and protect that, and then it will all be okay. No, our position is way too fragile. The world is way too dynamic. The talent and the knowledge is so many places that even though holding is our preference, you actually have to put these things in motion to continually advance. And I think that's what you two, also articulate.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of observations. I think we are increasingly moving in this direction at the moment anyway. It's a different thing because what I'm about to talk about is assessments. But the release of the assessments of Russian intent around Ukraine was completely unprecedented and showed that if there is a better appreciation of risk, people will be able to take different types of assessments on sharing. Now, as I say, that is slightly different from the kind of huge sort of data threat. Well, that's a slightly different thing, but nevertheless, there are some lessons there. The other thing I think that we need to do a much better job of, and I'll be absolutely candid about this, is to dispel this idea that AUKUS is about some kind of cozy Anglophone club. This is about 3 nations in Pillar 1 and potentially many more than 3 nations in Pillar 2 collaborating for the greater good, for the safety and security of, in particular, the Indo-Pacific, but sort of kind of more broadly than that, as well as I say, sort of the interoperability of fleets is going to benefit the UK and the Atlantic in due course, sort of kind of hugely. But we need to really get across and be more open and more straightforward and more persuasive with other nations whose interests are being served by this, that is indeed the case, and there is no sort of kind of cozy, as I say, sort of Anglophone club about that. And I think we have not done, candidly, quite as well on that as we could have done.
It's interesting that in the reactions since March, there's quite a body actually of tacit support for AUKUS in the region. Governments don't always feel like they can come out and express that support strongly, publicly, but it is there, and I think that goes to your point about the underlying purpose around upholding stability. And I think other countries see that, and that means there is a sort of, at least to an extent, a shared appreciation of what's happening in the region and something for us to build on. I want to take the conversation in a slightly different but related direction, and that is to ask the panel about what I'll call for our purposes this morning, technological decoupling. I mean, decoupling has become a sort of loaded and difficult word in this debate about geopolitical competition, but how we should think about high-tech decoupling, limited decoupling. Is it something we should welcome? Is it something we should be concerned about? Is it something we should be encouraging? Is it something we should be trying to wind back? How do we get the right balance between our traditional openness to ideas and technology and people, moving around, but going back to that earlier imperative of protecting technology? So, how should we think about that, Michelle?
Well, as we're discussing, I'm thinking about partnerships in a different way, and I think one of the things that AUKUS could definitely help is to look at the partnerships within each of the countries and how we get those to work better. So I'm thinking particularly the partnerships between government, industry, university, and defence. And so those are 4 areas where I think each of the countries is at a different level of maturity of how those work well together. So, for example, we get funding from US Defence, and that's been an incredibly strong partnership for 23 years now. And that's really given us an insight into how well the US understands the technological advantages and advances that are going on globally, because their defence and their government are working incredibly well together. I think Australia is very strong at its research base, and we have, because we're smaller, we're more likely to form partnerships with government and industry in a unique way. And so I look at those partnerships, and by each of the country assessing how each of the other does, and then sharing that information, and then sharing it across all 4 levels, I think is something that AUKUS can really help with. So, for example, Australia Defence does not get so involved in the high technology areas, so it looks at things that are close to what its soldiers need now on the field, or the very long term with submarines, but not that gap in the middle, whereas the US Defence strategically think more along those lines. And so I think looking at how we get those 4 sectors to work together within each country and across each country is a great way of strengthening the relationship in AUKUS.
So talk about your experience with In-Q-Tel, because you were the prime sort of driver of setting up In-Q-Tel. For those who aren't familiar with it, it's a non-profit company set up essentially to drive high-tech innovation and applications that can support the US and other wider intelligence community.
So I do think public-private partnership has been a strength between the US defense and intelligence community and the private sector. But it's been an interesting arc. When we started, we formed, I'm going to go back to my beginning, kind of World War II, we had this idea of federally funded research and development centers, and that was grabbing a whole bunch of technical talent, keeping it whole and intact for government use, and that served us incredibly well with double-hulled submarines and radar and so many things. But as time moved on, holding the talent meant that talent was getting farther away from the use, and so then you saw us do things like have partnership with individual companies, or I'll say Skunk Works and Lockheed Martin, to develop stealth technology. But even that, as it moved forward, became passé, because even then the technologies weren't within one company. And so In-Q-Tel was in the late 90s, because we realized that the innovation engine in the United States had moved to the Silicon Valley, and they didn't want to participate. And so how do you get that connection? So the idea there was, well, we will give, basically set up a private entity, we will give it big problems, and they will have the responsibility to give basically VC investment dollars to companies that were developing something that we wanted to keep alive long enough for it to become commercially available. And the real change was commercially available, open problems, and the government didn't hold the intellectual property, and that allowed that to move forward. I think we're at another watershed in terms of how we establish that public-private partnership. One, I think we have to think about the whole ecosystem of research, academia, government, industry, and think about how we strengthen all of that. So it's a little bit different model. The other thing that's a bit different is what are these problems? And, you know, so much of the technologies are being developed before the government has thought they're important. That lists of technologies that you want to protect are increasingly invalid because the world's moving on anyway, and now all you're doing is impeding those that had made the mistake of coming with you early. And so I think there's something about government being more in the business of identifying what are strategic technologies and looking at the threats and vulnerabilities to those, and then coming up with a collective view. And I think that's kind of the new, whatever the new InQtel would be, I think it would be more focused on those sorts of things.
Stephen?
Well, I very much agree with all of that. And I think that the sort of liberal democracies in particular need to rethink an approach to relying on the market, which by and large I, as an ex-investment banker, sort of kind of quite keen on. But I think there are sharp limitations in this area, to put it mildly. Can I just come back to your question about decoupling?
Please.
Which I think is aspects of it, because of this requirement to protect, are sort of inevitable. But in very broad part, I think it's not only going to be impossible in the modern world, it's also not going to be desirable. Impossible because, an attempt to replace the dollar as the world's reserve currency, I think, is sort of likely to be doomed to fail. The ability of travel and data transfer and all the rest of it to make effectively the world a very, very small place, and people to learn what other people are doing on the other side of the planet sort of kind of instantaneously pretty much is going to not be reversed. And I think it just feels sort of inconceivable, really, that we do end up in a decoupled kind of way. And I would resist it anyway, even if it was not, even if it were possible. And the reasons I would, and it's not just technological decoupling, by the way. People talk about the energy markets being decoupled, and you can certainly see the way that Russia is selling its energy at the moment is creating a sort of kind of slightly different energy market to the one that it used to play in. There are definitely financial services decoupling, with SWIFT clearly being denied to Russia and Russian firms at the moment. And and in some ways, I would also say that there is a sense that models of government are becoming sort of kind of a bit decoupled as well, with this talk about sort of kind of democracies here and autocracies sort of kind of over there. I do feel uncomfortable about that, because if you go down that kind of route, what you end up with is, we've only got the one planet. It feels increasingly small. If you get two sort of kind of blocks, I think the chances of conflict just rise enormously, and some of the problems that we all collectively face are by their nature global. And the two which obviously spring to mind are climate change and health security. And the idea that you would have sort of completely uncollaborative, contested relations between sort of two massive chunks in the world, I think is just the wrong model for some of the challenges as a globe that we face. Now, I don't wish to sort of kind of come across as a sort of kind of starry-eyed idealist on this, and I'm not normally accused of being that, but
no.
But I do think it is important that we try and resist this sense of a decoupling, whilst at the same time just being really careful about sort of kind of national and indeed sort of kind of international or self-interest, effectively.
Fair enough, but I would like to drill into this.
You're about to accuse me of being a starry-eyed idea.
No, I know you too well. A little further and talk about one specific example, which was 5G and the way that sort of played out, for us as countries and globally. Something which was very knowable, but the technology was out there. It was being developed, and then it was being introduced, and suddenly, at the policy level, oh gosh, where's this come from? What do we do about it? How do we think about that against the broader backdrop you just talked about, Stephen? And to widen that question, how do we avoid that sort of outcome happening again in a way that both keeps that sort of fundamental openness that your sort of cry from the heart was, I think, aspiring to, but also avoid the pernicious, security outcomes that certainly we judged, I think each of our countries judged weren't acceptable.
Sue and I were talking about this in the green room just before we came out, so I feel well prepped for that particular question.
Do it well.
Well, see if I can remember what you said. The 5G was a really interesting example. You're right. The problems associated with rolling out the UK's 5G network using that technology, in hindsight, are pretty obvious. I would say that the question actually comes back to something we were talking about sort of just 5 or 6 minutes ago, which is that increasingly in sort of kind of liberal capitalist societies, we have optimized for economic efficiency. And we have not optimized for resilience. And that decision, as indeed potentially some of the problems that we discovered in the beginning of COVID, when we realized that the UK didn't have a resilient pharmaceutical industry, and we're sort of kind of making steps to sort of kind of deal with that, need to be addressed. But I think we have to recognize that optimizing for resilience, or at least paying due accord to resilience, is expensive. And it's got to be paid for. And if people are not maximizing returns and profits, then, because the greater good demands that they do not do so, then that requires governments to be a bit more honest in some ways with their populations and their citizens. And I think that is a really, really big debate in a whole host of different areas at the moment. So, last point on this, I mean, the UK got to what I believe is the right decision, which is to effectively to remove what we thought was equipment which could be compromised from the network and replace it. Fantastically expensive exercise. Replacing cheap stuff with expensive stuff, not quite apart from the fact that you've got to remove a whole bunch of stuff. If the UK, it was a rich country, right? If the UK found that difficult decision to make, how much more difficult is it going to be for countries in the global south who are keen, understandably, for their populations to be connected to the world with 5G, and they've got an offer over here which is 20% of the offer from over there. We just need to, that's going to be expensive as well, making sure that we don't end up with the wrong answer there. So it raises some very, very big questions. And
one of them is, the role of intelligence, I guess, in sort of predicting that might be coming and
then communicating
warning it and communicating it so that the investment's not made in the wrong technology.
Yeah, because I think that's what's interesting about this story is disproportionately U.S. companies decided for their own economic reason to get out of the business of the base communications technology at exactly the same, very reasonable, right? They made choices for the fiscal success of their companies. At the exact same time, China was deciding that they were going to win at 5G. Did we bring those two views together? Did the intelligence community recognize that that was going to be the technology that defines the next 10 years? Did we see it as such? Did we put that in motion, and then did we communicate it? So when I think about Pillar 2 of AUKUS, you have started to identify those which are strategically significant technologies, and then you can start having those conversations globally, like not only within the partnership, but globally about, well, what are the threats to that, what are the vulnerabilities, and what do we need to assure to be able to have it? So I think there's a lesson on there.
Michelle, what worries you sort of out there over the horizon?
Well, so look, I think the interesting thing about that is that we do have companies now that are ahead of where government and defence are thinking. And I think those companies are out there pushing the forefront of the technology in a way that you would want them to, because you want the technology to come to fruition. So certainly with our company, we are led by the technology. We want it to be successful, so we're doing what it takes. But at the same time, obviously, it has strategic and national interests in terms of intelligence and security. And so we, right from the get-go, got the Australian government involved as a shareholder in the company so that they could see what was happening, and they were informed as the technology moved forwards. And I think that's been very beneficial for us. I think for us, we still want to bring defence into that equation, because obviously defence is quite critical going forwards. But hopefully those kind of unique structures that we've created with university, corporate, and government together are ways that we can offset the risk going forwards and keep the people that need to be aware of where those technologies are going right in the thick of it as it's evolving.
Just put in a small sort of plug here for the ONI-led Cyber and Critical Technology Intelligence Centre, which led by Fergus Hansen, who's here today, which we see playing a key role in linking government stakeholders into the policy community, but also out to industry and talking about these issues and making sure that there's good communication.
And one of the things we haven't talked about as much is the role of kind of reasserting the role of governments in the R&D, because we've just so much work going on in private companies that I think the government pulled back a little bit, particularly with some of the technology we're talking about. When you mentioned cyber, some of the things that governments need in assurance, in writ large in cyber and AI and all those things, companies may not alone pay for. Even if they are invested in by the government, those companies will benefit from it. So identifying those things where the government disproportionately should be investing in the advances is another interesting point. And then goes, Michelle, to your point about how we build that ecosystem and that flow through from academia.
One thing I'd like to touch on is data and again how we should be thinking about that. There's the argument that again the more authoritarian sort of technology powers have this sort of inherent advantage from their sort of large-scale data harvesting, lack of privacy and other restrictions on them, versus the sort of freer, less joined up, more ethics-based approach in the West. But it strikes me that that's a bit too simplistic. How should we think about that in this broader, global context?
Okay, so there are two pieces. Then Stephen.
No, far away.
Yeah, thanks. Sue, you go first.
Yeah.
I think there are two ways to think about this. There's how do you assure the data that you have? Especially because over the last 15 years, we have seen that competitors, adversaries, China is just a great example of this, has actually been acquiring data at an alarming rate. And with their supercomputing capability and their advancements in AI, they're getting really good practice on the use of data. So one half of this equation is how do we make sure that we protect the data? And then the second is the concept of speed that I think you mentioned earlier, and is so true now, is you actually have to be able to use the data. And there are a lot of elements of data use. One is systems that can share it at speed with machines that can use it. The second is imagining the use before you actually collect the data, because there's so much work that we do to try and make it useful after it's been collected. So thinking about the protect and use side much more effectively is actually, I think, a role that this collective can play, and that when that's achieved, what's nice about some of these things in data and data security and data use is it does actually benefit society outside just the defense thing. So this is one of those things that is very good government, where we invest for things that we need, but then it raises the level on its side. So I think looking at the use and protect side of data is the whole game right now. Go.
This is not an area that I'm a great expert on. I would say I think we are at a disadvantage. I mean, I think there's no question about that, but possibly not quite as much of a disadvantage as some of the raw numbers that one occasionally sees imply, because there is a sort of kind of real serious garbage in, garbage out sort of kind of problem in some of the ways in which our adversaries are using this kind of information. It's sort of extremely indiscriminate. It's not clear sort of kind of what the purpose is, and even if there is a use case at the end of it, it's not one that possibly we sort of kind of might worry about as much as we occasionally do. That is not to say that we're at a disadvantage, because I think we are at a disadvantage, but I don't think we're probably at quite as much of a disadvantage as sometimes we think. I mean, I agree with Sue. I mean, we do have advantages in terms of integrity of data, assurance of data, and use cases, I think.
Yeah.
And you know, probably in this context, a sort of slightly more rifle shot sort of kind of approach to this is the right way forward. But it's. I mean, I think we are at a disadvantage. I mean, let's be clear. And it's going to be something which over the coming years, no doubt, will become more of a question.
Yeah, just one sentence as you said that. I do think there is a risk in a world where all the data are available that looks the same as curated data. Right, and so you do have the intelligence systems that pride themselves on being able to do that kind of assessment of whether it's true or not true in terms of legitimate, not content-wise. And then the craft of intelligence is dealing with what is fundamentally uncertain with a framework that allows someone to deal with it with certainty. You know, if I look at Ukraine as a really good example of how much data in the open they used, I think it's great because it gave them information and speed and activity. I do think over time it's worth looking at to see, were they dealing with garbage? Did they deal with it with the limitations of the data? And so I think one of the interesting challenges is in a world where so much is available outside our structures, how do we have the structured work that we think is our foundation keep up so that it's not just taken over by something that sounds the same but is actually critically less assured? I think that's one of the risks right now as well, just within our own systems.
Just sidebar on Ukraine, actually. There will be deeply fascinating work about the lessons from Ukraine. There was an assumption that there weren't lots of cyber attacks on Ukraine beforehand or during, but that's wrong. There were. How did the Ukrainians sort of kind of protect against those? Really, really interesting. Private sector, by the way, Microsoft made a very big contribution to that. For that type of conflict, the strategic importance of high precision, long range fires is something which now everybody sort of kind of gets, wasn't being talked about sort of, 3 years ago, really wasn't. So that's sort of interesting. One of the other ones which I think is going to be a really important set of lessons, and this goes to the usability of data, and is one of the strands in Pillar 2 of AUKUS, is the control of the electronic warfare, the EW environment. It's just made an enormous amount of difference to the success or otherwise of some of the activities which have been taking place on both sides. And that is, so there's lots of ways of sort of kind of getting into this subject, and there are some, there are some live situations where we can really see what difference is being made.
Thanks. Michelle?
Yes, I'm again thinking slightly differently. So I see data as obviously something that is an immediate challenge globally. And I think what we're looking at in the quantum space is what will be the next hardware and the next technological changes, the transformational changes which will change the way that we deal with data that we're looking at now. And so I guess for me, that's an immediate need, but the quantum is coming, and being at the forefront of that to make sure that we understand what implications that has for information as we go forwards is quite critical. And I think one of the things I guess I get slightly nervous about is that a lot of people think quantum is still many years away, but the amount of investment going into that is phenomenal, and the advances are rapid. And so being ahead of the game and understanding how that's going to come in and being skilled up to understand it, I think is quite critical for the nations, and to work together to make sure that we collectively pool our resources to be at the very forefront.
Thank you. We have about 5 minutes left. I'm going to offer our panellists a chance to make a sort of 1.5 minute, concluding, type comment or an exhortation. It could be a call for government to do X, Y, or Z, or it could just be a broader observation. So, Sue, why don't you go first?
I think this is a time of public-private partnership to achieve the collective effect that we seek through the AUKUS partnership, which really is about security for free and open society. So I think we're not kidding about the need for both government and the private sector to come together. I think it's important to not mash that up, but actually understand what each subsection is really good at. I think the government is really good at big problems and articulating those. We ought to articulate those. We ought to know what we're trying to achieve. The outcome ought to be what is shared, and then you find the things within it. So good purpose is what government is good at. Government is really good at long time horizons. And while that doesn't mean being slow, it does mean think about second and third order effects and what you're going to need when the future becomes the present. And the third thing the government is good at is deep pockets, and it needs to bring those to this moment. And what the private sector is really good at is competing for solutions to those things in meaningful fashion. And what both sides need to do is stop holding on to the 60% of what we do, which is our preference in how to do it, rather than how we could do it if we must come together. So that's my final pitch.
Michelle, that's a nice segue to you, surely.
Yeah, look, so I definitely agree with that. I think the thing that I would hope AUKUS would do was to create that new thing, that bold, mission-based way that the three nations can work together on a bold mission. That would be fantastic. And I think in amongst that, I think it will be critical to have government in there for the strategic long-term benefit for each of the nations. But then also to recognise that the research at the forefront is happening in the universities and the private sector. So how do you harness that strategically for the nations and then have defence as a component of that? So there's a lot of things in there, but bold, ambitious, all nations working together to go faster by collaborating and then bringing those sectors together.
Stephen, the last word.
I couldn't really add to those concluding sort of kind of observations. I completely agree with them. Academia, private sector, government, there needs to be some new paradigm that we develop, and AUKUS can be a really important part of that. The other thing I would just say, and this goes back a little bit to the question you asked me right at the very beginning, which was, are there any sort of things that you would like to clarify about what AUKUS is about? It's also about parity of initiative between the nations who are involved, not just the three here, but also the ones who will come in on various specific areas. And it should not be missed that Australia was the principal initiator of AUKUS for all the right reasons. Right. And that clarity and boldness and bravery, I think, is very, very impressive and bodes well for the future of our joint endeavours to come.
Well, thank you. I think that's a suitably upbeat note on which to bring things to a conclusion. We're only 6 seconds over time. I'd just ask our audience to join me in thanking our panellists today.